This video is meant to provide the rest of the information on the official poverty measure. Remember where we left off last time. Molly Orshansky had developed her 48-cell matrix of poverty thresholds. But the problem is a threshold alone is still not a poverty measure. You need to know a household's annual income and be able to compare that to the threshold to know their poverty status, whether they're poor or not poor. And you need all of that information to come up with any sort of poverty rate. What percentage of the population are poor? But remember Molly's research project. The Census Bureau was already using an instrument called the Current Population Survey to get information on people's income. And her research project was to use that instrument to assess the economic well-being of American children. Now, the Census Bureau is still the main agency, or one of the main agencies responsible for getting information on people's incomes in the United States. And the Census Bureau is basically an organization that does household surveys. Lots and lots of household surveys. As you can see, this is a list of all the surveys that the Census Bureau conducts. The American Community Survey is a huge survey. A lot of social scientists use that survey for a lot of things. Here's the big one, the Current Population Survey. They participate with the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Consumer Expenditure Survey. We'll learn more about that one in the future. Interesting that the Census Bureau also conducts the major national crime survey in our country, the major national education survey, different kinds of health surveys, all kinds of surveys. So it's basically a survey agency. The Current Population Survey is administered in an interesting way. The Census Bureau conducts this survey all the time. It's continuously ongoing. Every month they choose 98,000 addresses that they have a statistical formula that tells them that these addresses are representative of the population as a whole. They send a letter to each of those 98,000 addresses saying, congratulations, you've been selected for the CPS sample, and usually around 50 to 60,000 of those addresses turn out to be occupied with households eligible to participate and able to be interviewed. And then what happens is one adult in the household, one adult over 18 years old, is interviewed either in person. The Census Bureau has a lot of field offices all over the country, or most of the time over the phone. And they're interviewed during the week containing the 19th day of the month. And that same adult is interviewed once per month for the next 3 months during, again, the week containing the 19th day of the month. Each of these interviews takes 10 to 15 minutes. Then that household is not interviewed at all for 8 months. Then, after a year, 4 months in, 8 months out, that same adult is interviewed again in person over the phone for the same 4 months the following year. This is what the Census Bureau calls a 4-8-4 survey design. Once that address is sampled, it permanently leaves the CPS sample. So a household might be sampled again if they move to a different address, but no one at that address would be sampled again. If you're really interested, you can check out the questionnaire that the trained interviewers for the Current Population Survey use. It's a very, very long document. They have to learn how to ask all of these various questions. Feel free to pull that up if you're interested. This survey has been administered since 1940, so it's a great source of data. Again, this is what Molly was told in her research project to use. It gets redesigned about once a decade. Recently, they've been redesigning the order in which some of the income questions are answered. Now, the CPS alone is not necessarily how we get our official income and poverty information. Once a year, in March, a supplement is added to the Current Population Survey, and this is the Annual Social and Economic Supplement, or the ASEC. So if you happen to get sampled in March, you will have this supplement added to your CPS interviews. The interviewer in the ASEC portion of the interview asks whether anyone in the household received income from about 18 different sources, and they ask this question about the previous year. So if you were sampled in March of 2016, the interviewer would have asked you, did anyone in this household receive income from source A during the year 2015? And then the interviewer would go through source B, source C, source D. The sources that they ask about include earnings from jobs, survivor benefits or Social Security payments, veterans benefits, pensions, retirement accounts, unemployment, workers' compensation, disability, trusts, rent, gifts, and even more than that. So first they ask whether anyone in the household received income from these sources, and that's just a yes or no question. And then they ask the adult they're interviewing about the amount of income that each member of the household received from each source. And again, this question is asked about the previous year. So, how do we, as a country, get the information that is, for the most part, used for official statistical purposes about people's income? We just ask them. We basically utilize a survey approach to getting information about people's income. We don't ask everyone, we just ask a representative sample. We ask about 50 to 60,000 households a month, every month. So, the percentage of people who report incomes to CPS interviewers during the month of March, when the annual social and economic supplement is added to the CPS, the percentage of people who report incomes to those interviewers that are below the poverty threshold for their household type, all of that gets extrapolated to become the nation's official poverty rate. So here's the first of a couple of important notes. We've only really been officially measuring poverty in the United States for about 50 years, which really isn't that long when you zoom out and look at the grander scope. It's been 240 years since the Declaration of Independence. It's been 400 years since the Mayflower. So we have a pretty short time period to look at when we talk about measuring poverty. The second important note is that we need to ask who's being sampled. The current population survey only samples the resident, civilian, non-institutionalized population. That's a quote from the Census Bureau's methodology. What this means is that a lot of people are not even included in the current population survey sample. Prisoners are considered institutionalized, so they are not sampled. Nursing home and long-term care facility residents, people with, let's say, severe lifelong disabilities, these people are also considered institutionalized, so they are not sampled. Here's where you become relevant. Students living in what they call group quarters or dormitories are not sampled. The only way you might be included if you live in a dormitory in the current population survey is if your family members back at home answer about you. Similarly, because it's a household survey, the unsheltered homeless, and in most cases actually also the sheltered homeless, are not included in the survey. The military are also another large group of people who are not, for the most part, not included in the sample. Anyone living in group quarters or barracks is not included in the sample. And if a member of the armed services doesn't live in a barracks, but doesn't belong to a household with at least one other civilian, then they would not be included in the sample. Another important group of people who are not sampled in the CPS are foster children who live with families but are not legally related to those families. We'll return to the interesting case of foster children when we look at the supplemental poverty measure. The current population survey defines a household as people who co-reside at the same address and are legally related through birth or marriage. And foster children are not legally related, although they may co-reside. So the official data comes out in a beautiful report from the Census Bureau every year. If you really want to nerd out on these things like me, you'll notice that this report gets issued in September of every year. So it won't be long, usually comes out mid-month, but pretty soon we should be getting the report for 2015. It's always a year retroactive. And this is basically what the report looks like every year. There is a section on income and a section on poverty, and both of those sections begin with highlights. And that's the place to go if you just really want to know in a quick fashion the information. So there are a few important distinctions that it's important for you to know. Poverty is not the same thing as inequality. You can have lots and lots and lots of poverty and very, very, very little inequality. If everyone in the society is very, very poor, then you would have lots of poverty and very little inequality. People would be more or less close to one another. Longitudinal trends in poverty don't necessarily mean that longitudinal trends in inequality are going in the same direction. You could be having increasing poverty, and you could be having decreasing inequality. We're going to be talking a lot more about equality and inequality later in this unit. A third important note is that there is no official definition of the term low income. It is possible, and people often do this, to use income to poverty ratios of 1.5 or 2.0 to designate the low income population, but ultimately you have to specify which figure you're going to use. For example, the school lunch program, to be eligible for free school lunches, family's income is supposed to be less than 1.33 or 1.3. In order to be eligible, because that's considered low income. Another important distinction is between class and income quintile, or income decile, however you want to slice up the income tiers. Class is not the same thing. Class is a sociological category which is constructed through social networks, social connections, tastes and preferences, behaviors, identities, and so on. We can empirically verify your income quintile. We cannot empirically verify your class. This is a result of meaning making within society. The way in which people make meaning about class and class status is what determines class. So you can be in a very high income quintile, but other people can classify you, or you can classify yourself as lower class or as middle class, maybe because you like to drink a certain kind of beer, or maybe because you like to wear a certain kind of clothes. If you watch the reality television show Bayou Billionaires, these are residents of rural Louisiana who discovered natural gas deposits underneath their property and came into billions of dollars, and a reality show documented them going around and taking all kinds of fancy vacations, but they took a great amount of pride in identifying as lower middle class, even though they had very, very high incomes. Similarly, one can be in a very low income quintile, but be classified by others or classify oneself as upper class, whether that's through behaviors or tastes. Important to note that in this class we're mostly concerned with income quintiles. The category of class you can save for your sociology professors. And here are the income quintiles as recorded in the Census Bureau's annual report for 2014. If you know enough information about your family's income, you will be able to learn from this chart which income quintile your family falls into. And you can see here the distribution as well. So the lowest income quintile earned up to about $21,000, and all of the income that those people earned totaled up to 3.1% of all the income that was earned in 2014. By contrast, the highest income quintile earned over 112,000, and all of the income earned by that 20% of people totaled up to 51.2% of all the income that was earned in 2014. So another important distinction is the poverty rate and the poverty population. The poverty rate is always going to be a percentage. For the last several years, it's been fairly stable, or some might say stagnant. It's hovered between 13 and 15%. The poverty population is the same thing expressed as a frequency. How many people are actually poor? In the Census Bureau's most recent report, the size of the poverty population was 46.7 million people who are officially poor. Now, the poverty population could go up while the poverty rate remained level or even went down. And that might be due to population growth. It might be due to any number of factors. And the reverse could also be true. So it's an important distinction. Another important distinction that the Census Bureau always points out in its annual reports is the difference between chronic poverty and poverty spells. And this has to do with the duration of poverty. Chronic poverty is considered to be a household that is officially poor for 48 consecutive months, whereas a poverty spell is considered to be 2 consecutive months where the household is officially poor. And what we learned from the Census Bureau's report is that chronic poverty, 48 consecutive months of a household being officially poor, is pretty rare. Only 2.7% of households experienced chronic poverty. Whereas poverty spells are actually pretty common. More than 1/3 of American households had a poverty spell in the most recent Census Bureau report on income and poverty. It's important to note, though, this data cannot come from the current population survey because there are limitations on its longitudinality. In other words, it only follows the same household for that 4-8-4 pattern. It only follows them for 16 months. So how could it measure 48 consecutive months? The Census Bureau, it turns out, has a different survey, the Survey on Income and Program Participation, which is used to measure chronic poverty. Another important distinction is between poverty and what experts often call deep poverty. And the most frequent way of quantifying this is income to poverty ratios. So 1.0 would be the income to poverty ratio for a household which was making exactly as much income as its poverty threshold. And anyone below 1 indicates that a household is making less than its poverty threshold. An income to poverty ratio of 1.1, 1.2, and on up is making more than its poverty threshold. Other experts will use percentages of the poverty threshold, and this is just the flip side of the coin of income to poverty ratios. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about 200% of poverty, and what they mean there is taking into account that family's household type if they're making twice their poverty threshold. So 200% of poverty and a 2.0 income to poverty ratio turn out to be the same thing. One last important distinction in learning about the official poverty measure is between poverty thresholds and poverty guidelines. Poverty thresholds are the 48-cell matrix, which you've seen. It's still derived from Molly's original calculations and updated only for inflation. The Census Bureau, which is part of the Department of Commerce, sets poverty thresholds, and the thresholds are used for statistical purposes like calculating poverty rates. Poverty guidelines are slightly different. They are set by the Department of Health and Human Services. They're not far off in terms of monetary amounts from the poverty thresholds, but they're a little bit simpler. They just take into account the number of people in the household. They don't take into account numbers of children, number of householders over 65. These guidelines are used for the purposes of administering public benefits and means-tested programs and determining whether households are eligible for public benefits. And we'll be learning much more about all of those programs in the next class.